What does it feel like when the most produced tank in Japan's history turns from a symbol of innovation into a steel coffin with no escape? The Type 97 Chi-Ha helped crush an entire British division before lunch in Malaya, but later stranded its crew behind rivets that became deadly shrapnel, all while battle chaos was relayed by a blinking light board instead of voices. Inside these cramped hulls, a single flaw could tip victory into disaster. But the true danger wasn't outside the armor. It was buried in the design, and what happened next forced Japan to rewrite its entire armored warfare doctrine. Here's how one tank shaped history and paid the ultimate price. Japanese tank crews faced a problem that seems almost unthinkable today. In the heat of battle, their only lifeline for communication was a flicker of light or the clang of metal, not the sound of a human voice. The Type 97 Chi-Ha, like its cousin the Ha-Go, was built with riveted armor and a philosophy that prioritized simplicity and mass production over comfort or crew safety. Some Japanese tanks, especially the lighter Ha-Go, featured a disguised button on the rear hull, a so-called doorbell hidden as a fake rivet. Infantry could press it to signal the crew inside, a clever workaround for the chaos and noise that made shouting useless. Soviet engineers who captured a Ha-Go at Khalkhin Gol in 1939 found this doorbell one of the only features worth noting, a small detail that spoke volumes about Japanese doctrine. Infantry and tanks were meant to move as one, and the button was a physical bridge between them. But on the Chi-Ha, that bridge was missing. Crews had to rely on hand signals, flags, or simply hope the infantry kept up. Inside the Chi-Ha, things didn't get any easier. There was no voice intercom, no headset, and no way for the commander to shout orders over the roar of the Mitsubishi diesel engine. Instead, the designers installed a set of push buttons in the turret. Each button was wired to a light on a small board next to the driver. 12 buttons, 12 lights, each one standing for a different command. Forward, stop, left, right, fire, reverse, and so on. In theory, it was a clean solution. In practice, it forced the driver to split his attention between the battlefield and a panel of blinking bulbs. In the darkness, under fire, with the tank rocking and the air thick with diesel fumes, a missed signal could mean disaster. There was no way to ask for clarification, no chance to hear a warning shouted from the turret. The only dialogue was a silent code of lights. This system made the crew's workload heavier and their margin for error razor thin. Under calm conditions, it was barely manageable. In combat, it became a gamble. The smallest misunderstanding, one wrong button pressed, one light missed, could send the tank lurching into a ditch or straight into enemy fire. The Chi-Ha's communication quirks were more than just technical trivia. They shaped every moment inside the hull, and when the battle turned against them, they left the crew isolated at the worst possible time. Heat radiates from the engine block like a furnace pressed against your back. The Type 97 Chi-Ha's Mitsubishi V12 wasn't just powerful for its day. At 21.7 liters, it was massive, and it didn't stay politely tucked away in the rear. Instead, the engine jutted into the fighting compartment, stealing space from the crew and pushing the temperature inside to punishing levels. There was no firewall, no insulation to shield the men from the roar and heat. Metal plates vibrated underfoot. The air thickened with diesel fumes and sweat. In the tropics, the hull could become an oven. The cramped layout forced everyone into awkward positions. There was no turret basket, just a ring of exposed gears and a tangle of levers. The commander and gunner had to step around the engine bulge every time the turret traversed, sometimes tripping over the drive shaft or stumbling into each other. Ammunition racks lined the walls and floor, narrowing the paths even further. Some crews left the loader out entirely, judging that 3 men were less likely to get tangled up than 4. But that meant one man would be loading, aiming, and commanding all at once, with no time to rest or even breathe. When shells struck the hull, the danger multiplied. The Chiha's armor was built from riveted plates, cheap, easy to manufacture, but deadly for those inside. A direct hit could shear off rivet heads, sending them ricocheting through the compartment like shrapnel. There was no protection against these metal fragments. The crew had to hope the rivets held, or else risk being wounded by their own tank. If the tank caught fire or was knocked out, escape became a nightmare. There was no dedicated hatch for the driver or bow gunner. The only way out was to crawl over the ammunition, past the engine, and up through the turret hatch. Under fire, with smoke filling the compartment and the floor slick with oil, every second counted. Rivets popped loose, and bullets whined against the hull. In those moments, the design that seemed clever on paper became a trap. For the men inside, survival depended on speed, luck, and a clear path that rarely existed. July 3rd, 1939. On the Mongolian steppe near the Khalkhin Gol River, Japanese tank crews braced inside their Chi-Ha mediums as Soviet BTs and anti-tank guns opened fire. Colonel Yoshimaru, commanding from the front, was killed instantly when a shell struck his tank. Around him, the 3rd Tank Regiment faced a storm of Soviet firepower. The Type 97's 57mm gun, designed for infantry support, proved useless against the sloped armor of Soviet BT-5 and BT-7. Shells bounced off or failed to penetrate, while Soviet 45mm rounds tore through the thin, riveted Japanese hulls. In a single day, between 41 and 44 Japanese tanks were lost. Nearly an entire regiment wiped out before noon. Inside the Chiaiche, chaos reigned. The commander, already juggling navigation and gunnery, struggled to coordinate with his crew. Without a voice intercom, orders had to be given through frantic gestures or by hammering on the metal hull. The driver, eyes flicking between the battlefield and a dim signal lamp, sometimes missed a command entirely. Escape was nearly impossible. With no dedicated hatches for the driver or bow gunner, men trapped by fire had to crawl over hot engine blocks and ammunition racks, all while the compartment filled with smoke and shrapnel from sheared-off rivet heads. Survivors described the interior as an oven, thick with fumes and panic. The disaster at Khalkhin Gol went far beyond lost tanks. Japanese strategists, shocked by the scale of the defeat, abandoned the Strike North plan to seize Siberia. Instead, the Imperial Army turned south toward the Pacific, the Dutch East Indies, and eventually, Pearl Harbor. The Chi-Ha's first real test under fire exposed not just technical flaws, but a doctrine unprepared for modern armored war. What began as a bold experiment in Japanese tank design ended in a smoking graveyard on the steppe, with the fate of a nation's strategy rewritten in a single day. January 7th, 1942. Before sunrise, 12 Chi-Ha tanks from the Japanese 2nd Tank Regiment rumbled through the darkness, engines muffled by the thick Malayan air. British commanders had assured their men that tanks could not move through the jungle. They were wrong. The rubber plantations, planted in neat, endless rows, created perfect corridors for armored vehicles. Instead of choking vines and impassable mud, the Chi-Ha crews found hard-packed earth and straight lines, almost as if the plantations had been designed for them. The British Indian 11th Division was dug in along the slim river, guarding 2 critical bridges. As the first light crept across the trees, the Chi-Has burst from the shadows, guns blazing. Infantry scattered. British anti-tank rifles pinged harmlessly off the tank's thin armor. The defenders had no heavy guns in position, only roadblocks and wishful thinking. Japanese crews pressed forward, ignoring small arms fire that rattled against the hulls. By mid-morning, both bridges had fallen. The tanks rolled across, engines roaring, and the British line collapsed. In less than 6 hours, the Japanese had broken through an entire division, captured the crossings, and left the road to Kuala Lumpur wide open. For a moment, the Chi-Ha seemed unstoppable. Its flaws, cramped interior, awkward communication, thin armor, mattered less in the chaos of the jungle, where mobility and surprise counted for everything. The British, stunned by the speed and audacity of the attack, were forced into a panicked retreat. The myth of Japanese tanks as slow or obsolete vanished in the humid air. At Slim River, the Chiha was more than a machine. It was the spearhead of an army that had learned to turn the enemy's assumptions into its own advantage. At 2 a.m. on June 17, 1944, the hills above the American beachhead on Saipan erupted with the sound of engines and treads. 44 Japanese tanks, most of them Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, lurched forward in the darkness. It was the largest Japanese armor attack of the Pacific War, a last gamble ordered by desperate commanders who knew there would be no second chance. The tanks rolled down the slopes in tight formation, their crews cramped and sweating inside metal coffins, vision slits smeared with dust and sweat. Behind them, infantry followed on foot, hoping to break through the ring of American Marines before sunrise. The Americans had dug in along the beaches, expecting a counterattack, but even they were caught off guard by the scale and timing. As the first tanks appeared, Marine spotters called for illumination rounds. Seconds later, the night sky turned white as magnesium flares burst overhead, casting harsh shadows across the sand and jungle. The Japanese tanks, hoping to use darkness for cover, found themselves fully exposed, outlined for every anti-tank gun and Sherman crew on the line. Marines had painted their Sherman turrets in garish red and yellow stripes, a desperate measure to keep Navy pilots from mistaking them for enemy armor in the chaos. Now, under the flares, these colors stood out like beacons. The Japanese tanks pressed on, but the beach turned into a hilling ground. American gunners loaded armor-piercing shells and fired at silhouettes barely 100 yards away. The Chihas, with their thin riveted armor and obsolete guns, never stood a chance. Shells punched through hulls and turrets, setting off ammunition and sending hatches flying. Some tanks burned where they stopped, others rolled forward, crewless, until they bogged in the sand. By sunrise, the attack was over. Of the 44 tanks that started the charge, 33 lay destroyed or abandoned on the field. The rest limped back, tracks shattered, engines smoking. The Japanese infantry who followed were cut down or scattered. The largest tank assault Japan ever launched in the Pacific had ended in catastrophe. For the men inside the Chihas, there was no glory, only the knowledge that their machines, once symbols of innovation and power, had become relics on a modern battlefield. The island would soon become a graveyard, not just for tanks, but for the men who commanded them. Baron Takeshi Nishi was known for his Olympic gold medal in show jumping at the 1932 Los Angeles Games, but by 1945, he was commanding tanks on Iwo Jima, trading the cheers of Hollywood for the thunder of artillery. The 26th Tank Regiment, under his command, arrived on the island short-handed. Their original convoy had been torpedoed by the USS Cobia in July 1944, sending 28 tanks to the bottom of the sea. Nishi returned to Tokyo to secure replacements, taking a final visit to his beloved horse, Uranus, before returning to the front with just 22 tanks. On Iwo Jima, the Chiha mediums were dug in, camouflaged and waiting for the inevitable American assault. Nishi, always the horseman, was seen walking the volcanic ash in Hermes riding boots, a riding crop in hand, a memory of a different life. American loudspeakers called out across the battlefield, pleading with him to surrender, reminding him that the world would mourn his loss. Nishi never replied. As the battle raged, the limits of the Chiha's design closed in around his men. Escape hatches were unreachable under fire, and the tank's thin armor offered little protection from the bombardment. In March 1945, Baron Nishi was killed. Accounts differ on whether it was by gunfire flamethrower, or suicide in the chaos of collapse. His body was never definitively identified. 1 week later, Uranus died in Tokyo. The Olympic champion and his horse were gone, leaving behind only stories and a regiment buried in the black sand. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the Soviets handed over nearly 300 captured Chiha tanks to the newly formed People's Liberation Army. For Chinese crews, the old Japanese machines were both a gift and a headache. They called them the Old Man Tank, not out of respect, but because the Chiha broke down so often, it seemed to have one foot in the grave. Spare parts were rare, and the tank's thin armor and underpowered guns were no match for Soviet or American models flooding into Asia. Yet, in the chaos of the Chinese Civil War, even a worn-out Chiha could tip the balance. In October 1948, at the Battle of Jinzhou, a single Chiha Kai named Gongchen became a legend. After every other tank in its company slid into a ditch and was lost, Gongchen pressed on alone, shelling enemy positions and clearing the way for advancing infantry. The crew coaxed their battered tank through the ruins, surviving where newer machines failed. When victory came, the battered Chiha was chosen for an honor no one could have predicted. On October 1st, 1949, Gongchen led the victory parade through Tiananmen Gate, its Japanese silhouette rolling past Mao Zedong and the founding leaders of the People's Republic. A tank designed for imperial conquest now carried the flag of a revolution, its legacy sealed not by firepower, but by endurance. On the black sands of Iwo Jima, Japanese engineers built more than just tank emplacements. They sculpted decoys out of volcanic rock, crafting stone Chiha replicas that fooled American spotters and pilots. From a distance, these fakes looked real enough to draw gunfire, and airstrikes buying precious time for the defenders. Only 22 actual tanks remained on the island, dug in and camouflaged, while the dummies multiplied the threat in the minds of the attackers. While Chiha crews faced the enemy with 1938 technology, Japan's most advanced tanks sat idle hundreds of miles away. The Type 3 Chi-Nu, armed with a long-barreled 75mm gun, was built specifically to counter American Shermans. The Type 4 Chi-To and the prototype Type 5 Chi-Ri pushed even further. Heavier armor, bigger guns, autoloaders. But none of these machines ever reached the battlefield. All were held back for a final defense of the home islands, a battle that never came. As the war ended, these tanks were hidden in depots or simply scrapped, their potential never tested. When surrender became inevitable in August 1945, Japanese commanders ordered the destruction of technical archives. Blueprints, test results, and engineering notes fed the flames. With the records gone, the Chiha's story was left incomplete. Its failures and innovations filtered through the eyes of its enemies, and the full picture lost to history. Today, Museum Chihas sit silent, yet their story shapes how we judge innovation and failure in war. As new technologies promise smarter armor and smarter battles, the Chiha reminds us, design limits always become human limits. What we build for victory may one day define defeat. History leaves its lessons in steel. What will we learn before the next war writes its own verdict? Share your thoughts below.